The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Cromwell Tower was built to make a person feel small. That was the point of it, the floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking Burrard Inlet, the harbor lights scattered below like something deliberately beautiful. The table of pale ash wood, long enough to seat 20 but set today for 7. 6 of them were Cromwells, or people who worked close enough to the family that the distinction had stopped mattering. And then there was Martin Colquhoun, 38 years old, founder and sole director of Colquhoun Built, standing at the far end of the table in a suit that had cost him 3 months of careful saving, holding a leather folder he had carried up in the elevator like it might protect him from something. The number arrived before the pleasantries had properly settled. A senior counsel for Cromwell Development slid the offer letter across the ash wood without making eye contact, the way people slide things when they have decided the transaction is already complete. $750 million. Conditional on full operational transfer. Conditional on Martin stepping into the role of creative liaison. A title, the document made clear in its 4th paragraph, that carried no voting rights, no directional authority, no seat on any board. He read that paragraph twice, then he turned the page. And somewhere in the careful language of Schedule C, Clause 14, he understood exactly what was being offered. Not a partnership. Not even a buyout in the traditional sense. It was an erasure with a check attached. Clifford Cromwell hadn't spoken yet. He sat at the opposite end of the table in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Martin's first car, fingers laced together, watching with the particular patience of a man who had been waiting out negotiations since before Martin was born. When he finally did speak, his voice was measured and warm in the way that old money learned to sound warm. Not generous, but unhurried. "You've done something real here, Martin," he said. "I want you to know we respect that, genuinely. Colquhoun Built put sustainable urban design on the map in this country in a way that nobody expected from a shop your size." He paused just long enough for the compliment to settle before the next part landed. But sustainable architecture is still a niche, and niches don't scale without infrastructure, without capital, without the kind of institutional weight that, frankly, a man building alone in this market isn't going to accumulate in one career. One of the Cromwell sons, Martin didn't know which, they all had the same jaw, glanced down at his phone. Someone near the end of the table clicked a pen quietly. The room had that texture of people who had heard this version of a conversation many times and found it unremarkable. Diana Cromwell, Clifford's daughter-in-law and head of acquisitions, sat 2 seats to his right. She hadn't looked at Martin since he'd sat down. She was reviewing something on a tablet, swiping with the mild focus of a person who considered the outcome already settled. Martin heard it for what it was. Not an insult in the way that required you to raise your voice about it. Something colder. The kind of dismissal that arrived dressed as advice, that managed to say you are temporary without ever quite saying it aloud. He felt the exhaustion then, not the tiredness of that particular day, but the deeper kind, the years of it. The early mornings when Sloane was still small enough to need him physically present before sunrise, when he would set her up with cereal and a picture book at the kitchen table, and then open his laptop and work for 2 hours before she woke properly, those 2 hours being the only uninterrupted stretch he had. The nights he had driven back from city planning meetings in Edmonton and Winnipeg, arrived home past midnight, stood over her bed in the dark, just to hear her breathe before he let himself sleep. The times he had looked at the numbers, the cash flow, the overhead, the gaps, and understood that one bad quarter could end everything. And then his hand moved without quite deciding to, the way hands sometimes do when the body knows something before the mind has caught up. He reached into his jacket pocket and his thumb brushed across the phone screen, tilting it just enough to see the lock photo. Sloane, 8 years old, missing a front tooth, standing in the snow outside their house in North Vancouver wearing a hard hat she had borrowed from his work site. She was holding a small cardboard model of a house she had built herself, holding it up like a trophy, grinning like she had just invented architecture. Something in Martin's chest went still. Not quieter, just clearer. He set the phone face down on the table, then he looked at the offer letter again, then he closed it. The sound it made, the soft thud of the cover, was the only noise in the room for a moment. "I appreciate the offer," Martin said, and his voice was even, which surprised him a little. "And I hear what you're saying about scale. But what you're asking me to sign is a document that removes me from the decisions that made this company worth acquiring in the first place." He slid the folder back across the table. "That's not something I can do." Clifford Cromwell studied him with something that wasn't quite surprise. It was the expression of a man recalibrating a variable he had underestimated. Diana looked up from her tablet for the first time. Martin stood, collected his jacket from the back of his chair, and walked to the elevator. The Cromwell Tower lobby was cool and marble-floored and full of people moving purposefully in every direction. He stepped out into the rain of a Vancouver November and stood still for 30 seconds, letting it land on his shoulders, before his phone buzzed. A message from Sloane's school. Reminder, Thursday is the Heritage Fair. Sloane has asked if you can come to help set up her display. She says she's built something. He read it twice, then he exhaled, slow and long, and started walking toward the parking garage. The drive home took 40 minutes in the evening traffic on the upper levels. By the time Martin turned onto his street, his phone had accumulated 11 messages from his team. He read the preview lines at a red light, and felt the specific weight of knowing that his decision had consequences beyond his own life. When he opened the front door of the house, a narrow craftsman on the east side of the block, floors that creaked in the same spots they always had. Sloane was at the dining room table surrounded by pieces of cardboard, a glue gun, and what appeared to be a significant portion of a cereal box she had repurposed into the wall of something. She looked up the moment the door opened. "Dad." She said it the way she always did, like a statement of something obvious and necessary, then pushed back her chair and came across the kitchen in 3 quick steps and wrapped both arms around his waist. He held her for a moment longer than usual. "Big meeting?" she asked into his jacket. "Yeah." He pulled back and looked at her face, flour on one cheekbone from something unrelated, hair escaping its ponytail in 4 different directions, and felt the knot in his chest loosen by a fraction. "What are you building?" She led him back to the table with the gravity of someone presenting important evidence. Spread across the butcher paper was a model in progress. A small community, really, with streets and green spaces and buildings at different scales, each one cut from cardboard and painted in careful, slightly uneven colors. She had labeled them in pencil: library, community garden. The hockey rink had a tiny Zamboni she had made from a matchbox. "It's Pemberton," she said, "like where we went camping last summer, but the version where everyone has a place to live." Martin looked at it for a long moment. He didn't trust himself to say anything immediately. "I'm going to add solar panels," she said seriously, "on all the roofs, like yours." He cleared his throat. "It's incredible," he said. "Sloane, this is genuinely incredible." She accepted this with a small nod, the way she accepted compliments, not dismissing them, just filing them. "You look tired," she said, peering up at him. Tough day. She considered that. Was the meeting bad? "It was a lot," he said, the same answer he always gave when the real answer was too heavy for an 8-year-old to carry. "But I think I did the right thing." She turned back to her model and picked up the glue gun. "Then it's fine," she said simply, and went back to work. He sat down across from her and opened his laptop. The messages were waiting. His CFO, Bryn Halsey, had left 3 texts and 1 voicemail. The voicemail started with a silence long enough that Martin almost skipped it. Then Bryn's voice, measured and careful: "Call me when you're home. I need to understand what happened today." The next morning's meeting was the kind nobody wanted to call necessary, but nobody could pretend wasn't. 8 people around the table in the Colquhoun Built office on Powell Street, exposed brick, drafting tables along one wall, the smell of coffee and wood shavings that had been there since Martin signed the lease 6 years ago. His senior team, people who had left better-paying positions to work here because they believed in something. Bryn Halsey sat across from Martin with his hands flat on the table, which was never a good sign. Bryn was meticulous by nature, a man who wore the same kind of shirt in 3 different colors and kept his office in a state of considered order. Flat hands on the table meant he was working hard to stay measured. "The Cromwells were our path to Series B capital," Bryn said. "You know that. We've been operating on a margin that doesn't leave room for a principled stand." "I know. We have 43 employees." "I know, Bryn." "Then help me understand what you're planning to do in the next 60 days, because from where I'm sitting, the runway is." 2 months, said Priya Sankar, the head of project development, from the far end of the table. She said it quietly, without accusation, which somehow made it worse. "Maybe slightly more if we defer the Edmonton contract costs." The room went quiet in the way rooms went quiet when numbers stopped being abstract. Martin looked around the table. These were people who had trusted him. Priya had turned down a position at a Vancouver firm 3 times the size of Colquhoun Built because she believed in what they were building. Bryn had moved his family from Calgary. The 2 junior architects near the window were 6 months out of school, still carrying student debt, here because of something Martin had said at a university lecture 2 years ago that had made the work seem worth choosing. The weight of that settled on him differently than the Cromwell meeting had. Not like pressure from outside. Like responsibility, which was its own kind of gravity. "I'm not asking you to trust a feeling," Martin said. "I'm asking you to give me 72 hours to show you something I haven't been ready to show anyone yet." Bryn looked at him carefully. "What's something?" "Something that changes the conversation entirely." Martin kept his voice even. "If it doesn't, we'll sit back down and talk about every option on the table, including going back to the Cromwells." A long pause. 72 hours, Bryn said finally. It started that same afternoon, before Martin had even left the office. His phone began collecting notifications with a rhythm that felt deliberate, the kind of rhythm that wasn't coincidental. A municipal contact in Calgary sent a brief formal message about reviewing their ongoing agreement. A partnership they had been finalizing with a property group in Mississauga went suddenly quiet, then returned as a short note from an assistant about changed timelines. A request Martin had submitted to a federal green infrastructure working group came back citing procedural review. None of it was illegal. None of it was even provable as coordinated. But it had a pattern, and Martin had enough experience in development circles to recognize what a pattern like that meant. The Cromwells hadn't needed to make a single phone call that couldn't be explained as routine business. They just needed to apply the right kind of pressure in the right places and wait for the weight of it to do the work. He sat in his car in the Powell Street Parkade for 20 minutes after that realization, watching rain trace lines down the windshield. Then he drove to pick up Sloane from school. She was waiting at the gate in her yellow raincoat, backpack hiked up high, waving at him before he had even fully stopped. She climbed in, announced that her friend Mila's hamster had escaped during lunch period and been found inside a tuba, and asked if they could have soup for dinner. He said yes to the soup and laughed, genuinely, completely, at the hamster story, and for the length of the drive home he let himself be exactly where he was. After dinner, after the dishes, after Sloane had retreated to the dining room table, to work on Pemberton in miniature with the focused dedication she brought to everything she cared about. Martin sat in the armchair by the front window and opened a file on his laptop that he hadn't shown to anyone outside his small inner circle. He had started building it 3 years ago, almost as a side project, a framework for environmental performance certification that went beyond existing standards. Not because existing standards were bad, but because they weren't designed for what Canadian municipalities actually needed in the next 20 years. Adaptive buildings, community-integrated infrastructure, climate-responsive urban planning built for northern conditions. He had been quietly approached by 3 city governments who had found his technical papers through academic channels. He had signed preliminary agreements, said almost nothing publicly, and continued building the framework piece by careful piece. What Clifford Cromwell had called a niche company was, quietly, the backbone of what 3 major Canadian cities were about to mandate as their new green building standard. The Cromwells had valued Colquhoun Built based on what was visible. They hadn't known to look for what wasn't. Over the next 3 days, Martin made calls he had been holding in reserve. He didn't do it loudly. He didn't announce anything. He simply began moving pieces that were already in place, confirming timelines that had been drafted months earlier, putting names to agreements that had existed in principle, and needed only a signature to become real. He met with 2 municipal representatives in a hotel conference room off Robson Street. On the second evening, the kind of meeting where no press were invited and the agenda wasn't circulated. By the time he walked out of that building at 9:30 at night, certain things had shifted from probable to official. By the time 72 hours had passed, Bryn Halsey had reviewed the documentation in the file Martin shared with him at 6 in the morning on the 3rd day. Bryn read it twice, then he called. "Where has this been?" he said. "In development," Martin said. "I needed it to be right before I put it in front of anyone." A pause on the line. "Martin, this changes everything." "I know." Another pause. "The Cromwells don't know about this." "No." He could almost hear Bryn recalibrating on the other end. "How long before they find out through other channels?" "Weeks, Mix, maybe. If we move now, we control the announcement." The invitation from Cromwell Development arrived 4 days later. Formal letterhead. A request to resume discussions at Martin's earliest convenience. The tone carried the same careful language as before, but the word convenience was doing different work now than it had in previous correspondence. Martin read it standing in his kitchen at 7 in the morning while Sloane ate toast across the counter, and told him about a book she was reading about bridges, specifically about the engineers who built the original Quebec Bridge and the ones who came after and figured out what had gone wrong. She had opinions about this. She usually had opinions. He set the letter down and looked at her. "You know how you told me once that hard things are okay," he said. She looked up from her toast. "I said hard things are worth doing, it's different." He smiled at his different. "You're right." She considered this with the seriousness of someone who understood the distinction mattered. "Is something going to be okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he said, "I think it actually is." She studied him for a second, decided he meant it, and went back to the bridge book. He walked back into Cromwell Tower on a Tuesday morning and took the elevator to the 42nd floor for the second time. The lobby was the same cool marble, the same purposeful motion. But something in the way he crossed it had changed, not in the space itself, but in the weight he was carrying through it. In the boardroom, he didn't wait to be shown to his seat. He sat down, placed a slim portfolio on the table, and set his hands beside it with the ease of someone who had decided, before entering the building, exactly where he stood. When the Cromwells filed in, Clifford, Diana, two of the sons, their legal team, Martin noticed that the arrangement of the room felt different, though nothing had physically moved. Diana Cromwell sat across from him this time. She looked at the portfolio with the controlled expression of someone who had been briefed and was working to keep the briefing off her face. It was Clifford who spoke first. "We appreciate you coming back," he said. Martin nodded. "I appreciate the invitation." A beat. Something shifted in that beat, small but real. Martin opened the portfolio and slid the summary document across the table. Not with the flat, dismissive motion of the first meeting, more deliberately than that. "I want to show you what Colquhoun Built actually is," he said, "as opposed to what it looked like from where you were standing." The next 40 minutes were not dramatic. That was the thing about real leverage. It didn't need to perform. The municipal certification framework spoke for itself. The letters of intent from 3 city governments, the federal working group position that had been building quietly for 2 years, the academic partnerships that had been translating into infrastructure mandates on a timeline nobody outside the process had known to watch for. Each page built on the last with a logic that was simply hard to argue with, because it was accurate. Clifford Cromwell turned pages more slowly as they progressed. The son on his left stopped checking his phone around page 5 and didn't pick it up again. Diana read everything twice, which Martin had noticed she did when something required her full attention rather than just her assessment. When they reached the end, Clifford set the document down and looked at Martin for a long moment. "You sat across this table 2 weeks ago and let me explain market niches to you," he said. There was something in his voice, not quite embarrassment, but the thing adjacent to it that men in his position allowed themselves instead. "And you didn't say a word about any of this." "I wasn't ready to," Martin said. "And the offer you brought to that meeting wouldn't have worked regardless. The document wasn't really the problem." Clifford studied him with an expression that had shed the warmth-as-strategy quality it had carried before. This was something more direct. The look of a man reassessing a calculation he had been confident in. Diana spoke then for the first time since the room had settled. "What do you want the structure to look like?" she asked. Her voice was precise and practical, the question of someone who had moved past whether to negotiate to the question of how. Martin had thought carefully about this answer, not what would sound strong, what was actually true. "A genuine partnership," he said. "Shared governance, equal say on the design and environmental mandate. My team stays intact and operates with independence within the larger structure. The certification framework stays under Colquhoun Built. The Cromwell name doesn't go on it. What you get is access to the municipal contracts, the institutional relationships, and the expertise to build what the next generation of Canadian cities actually needs." He paused. "What I get is the capital to scale, without surrendering what made this worth scaling." The room was quiet. Clifford looked at Diana. Diana looked at the document. The son who had put his phone away was looking at Martin with an expression that was almost curious, like a person encountering a variable they hadn't expected to find interesting. "That's not a small ask," Clifford said. "No," Martin agreed, "but it's a real one." Another silence, the kind that had weight in it. "We'll need a week to review the full framework," Diana said finally. She looked at him steadily. "But I think you should know this is a different conversation than the one we thought we were walking into." Martin held her gaze. "I know." He gathered the portfolio, stood and shook hands around the table. When he reached Diana, her handshake was firm and her expression was composed, but something in her eyes had shifted from the calculating assessment of the first meeting. Something closer to equity. The recognition of one person by another, which was not the same thing as agreement, but was considerably rarer than it sounded. He took the elevator back down through 42 floors of glass and steel and walked out into the Vancouver afternoon. The rain had paused. The inlet was silver in the flat November light. He stood still for a moment, not from uncertainty this time, but from the specific quiet that settled after doing something correctly. His phone buzzed. A photo from Sloane's school sent by a teacher. Sloane at the Heritage Fair display table, standing beside her Pemberton model, which had been completed overnight with solar panels added to every roof and a new building she had labeled Community Hub in her careful printing. She was wearing the hard hat again. She had apparently brought it from home without telling anyone, and holding a small handmade sign built by Sloane Colquhoun, age 8. Martin stood on the sidewalk outside Cromwell Tower and looked at that photo for a long time. Long enough that someone walking past glanced at him, probably wondering why a man in a suit was standing still on the pavement in the November cold, looking at his phone like it held something irreplaceable. It did. The weeks that followed moved at a different pace than any period Martin could remember in the history of the company. The Cromwell partnership agreement was redrafted from scratch, not the document they had slid across the table the first time, but something negotiated clause by clause, in meeting rooms where Martin's legal team sat alongside theirs as equals. There were difficult conversations. There were points where the whole thing nearly broke down and had to be rebuilt from a different starting position. Nothing about it was clean or linear or resolved in a single satisfying moment. But it held. And in the margins of those weeks, life continued in the way life did when you were raising a child alone and running a company and trying to be fully present for both. There were school pickup runs and permission slips, and a Wednesday evening when the furnace stopped working, and Martin spent 3 hours on the phone with a technician, while Sloane built a blanket fort directly over the one heating vent that still worked and declared it, with some satisfaction, an exercise in passive solar design. There were evenings when the work came home with him in the form of a tight jaw and distracted eyes, and Sloane would notice without making a production of it, just move her chair a little closer to his at the table and continue working on whatever she was working on, the presence of her being enough. On a Thursday evening in December, with snow coming down soft and steady outside the kitchen window, Sloane put down her pencil and looked across the table at him. "Did the big meeting work?" she asked. The same question she'd been asking in some version for weeks. Martin set down his own pen. Outside, the street was quiet and blue-white with new snow. Inside, the house smelled of the pasta they'd had for dinner and the particular warmth of a small, inhabited space that had absorbed years of someone caring for it. "Yeah," he said, "it worked." She nodded once, the way she nodded when something confirmed what she had already quietly decided was true. Then she picked up her pencil, turned back to her notebook, and added something to a drawing she had been working on for most of the evening. A few minutes later, she pushed it across the table. It was the two of them, her in her hard hat, him in his suit, standing in front of a building that had a round window at the top, solar panels running the full length of the roof, and a small flag above the entrance. In the background, she had drawn other buildings, smaller, spreading outward like a neighborhood growing in every direction. Above it all, in the careful capital letters of a child who understood that certain things deserved to be stated plainly, she had written, "We built this." Martin looked at it for a long time. He thought about the table on the 42nd floor, the offer letter with its clean, lethal clauses, the number that was supposed to make the decision simple. The moment he had closed the document and understood, without being able to fully explain it yet, that some things were worth more than numbers that could be written on paper, because they weren't the kind of things paper was designed to hold. He thought about what Clifford Cromwell had been wrong about, not the facts of the market which were real enough, not the realities of capital which were just as real, but the assumption underneath those facts, the quiet belief that a man building alone would eventually become tired enough to let go of what he was building. That principle, pressed hard enough, bent toward convenience, that the right number, offered at the right moment of exhaustion, would always be sufficient. It was an understandable assumption. For a long time, for a great many people, it had been accurate. It just hadn't accounted for Sloane in her borrowed hard hat, standing in the snow, holding up a cardboard house she had made herself, grinning like she already knew something important about the world that the rest of it was still catching up to. Martin picked up the drawing carefully and held it with both hands. "Can I keep this one?" he asked. "That's why I made it," she said, already reaching for a new sheet of paper. He set it down in front of him, where he could see it, and for the first time in longer than he could easily name, the future felt like something he was moving toward on his own terms. not in spite of everything that had tried to take it from him, but because of everything he had refused to give away.